The hiss of encrypted static was the only sound that mattered. In the sterile, blue-lit confines of the Combined Air Operations Center, it was a death-rattle broadcast from half a world away. On the main holographic display, a topographical map of the Zagramos Mountains glowed with malevolent red icons. They swarmed a single friendly blue marker, designated Trident, which had ceased moving 30 minutes ago. Status now. Colonel Marcus Vance's voice cut through the low hum of the servers. He stood with his hands braced on the central console, his knuckles white. Vance was a man built from regulations and statistical probabilities, and right now every algorithm and field manual told him the same thing: Trident team was gone. A young communications officer, his face pale under the monitor glow, adjusted his headset. "Sir, intermittent comms from Trident Actual. They're pinned down in a dry riverbed. Designation Wadi Serpentis heavy machine gun and mortar fire from elevated positions on both sides of the canyon. Their exfil route is compromised." Vance's eyes narrowed, tracing the canyon's contours on the map. It was a death trap. Perfect L-shaped ambush. What about air support? The air component commander, a grizzled general patched in via video link, shook his head. "Negative, Marcus. The ceiling is dropping, and that valley is lousy with manpad signatures. We've run the sortie simulations. Survivability is less than 20%. We send a standard CS package in there. We're just losing more assets." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The blue marker, representing 6 of the most elite operators in the world, was being methodically erased. They were being sacrificed on the altar of acceptable risk. The models had spoken. In the back of the room, away from the central dais, Major Anya Sharma stood with her arms crossed. She wore a flight suit, the fabric faded over the shoulders and thighs from thousands of hours spent strapped into a cockpit. Her presence was quiet, almost invisible amidst the frantic energy of the command staff. She wasn't looking at the frantic officers or the grim-faced colonel. Her gaze was fixed on the holographic map, not at the icons but at the spaces in between. She saw the shadows, the wind currents, the subtle curvatures of the rock that the simulation software, for all its processing power, couldn't truly comprehend. Vance finally looked up from the console, his gaze sweeping the room in a gesture of finality. It was a look of grim resignation. "Get me a line to Stratcom. We need to start drafting the CONUP for a recovery, not a rescue." His eyes flickered past Major Sharma without a hint of recognition. She was just another pilot on standby, a cog in a machine that had just been told to stand down. To him, she was a data point, and her F divided by a -18E Super Hornet, currently sitting armed and fueled on the flight line, was an asset with a 20% survivability rate. Unacceptable. He saw the numbers. She saw the sliver of a chance, a thread of possibility woven into the granite and the storm clouds. And she knew that for the men on the ground, a 1% chance was infinitely better than 0. The mission was impossible. The models said so. The colonel said so. The silence in her own mind said something else entirely. Colonel Vance's voice was clipped, devoid of hope. "The mission is a no-go. The operational parameters dictate we cannot risk a flight asset for a low-probability extraction. Trident team will attempt to break contact and move to a tertiary exfil point." It was a death sentence delivered in the sterile language of command procedure. Everyone in the room understood that attempt to break contact meant they were on their own. Vance gestured to the holographic map, where red triangles representing SAM emplacements and AAA batteries pulsed like angry heartbeats. "The terrain masking flight paths are saturated. The enemy holds the high ground. Any approach below 10,000 feet is suicide. Any approach above is a clear target for their Igla and Stinger teams. The window is closed." He finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the assembled aircrew. It was a formality. He was dismissing them. His eyes, cold and analytical, passed over the male pilots, giving a slight, almost imperceptible nod of shared, grim understanding. When his gaze fell upon Major Anya Sharma, it lingered for a fraction of a second longer. But the look was different. It wasn't accusatory, not quite. It was procedural. She was a female pilot, one of a handful in the wing, a statistical anomaly in his world of bell curves and predictable outcomes. Her record was impeccable, her flight hours staggering, but records were historical data. This was a real-time crisis that defied conventional solutions. He saw a pilot, an asset. He didn't see the answer. We will maintain a holding pattern with a Reaper drone for ISR, but do not, I repeat, do not engage. This is a monitoring operation only, Vance concluded, his tone leaving no room for argument. Dismissed. The pilots began to file out. Their shoulders slumped, the frustration and impotence a palpable weight in the room. They muttered to each other in low tones, cursing the weather, the enemy, the damned probabilities that had tied their hands. Sharma remained where she was, her eyes still locked on the twisting, treacherous canyon on the map. She saw the wind shear data scrolling on a secondary screen, the fluctuating barometric pressure. The storm that the others saw as an obstacle, she saw as cover. The treacherous terrain they saw as a barrier, she saw as a shield. Vance noticed she hadn't moved. He walked over, his boots making sharp, authoritative sounds on the polished floor. Major, you have a question. Anya finally turned her head to look at him. Her expression was neutral, her dark eyes calm and unreadable. She spoke for the first time, her voice steady and low, carrying no trace of insubordination, only fact. The simulation models for low-altitude ingress, are they factoring in transonic atmospheric distortion within a confined resonant cavity? Vance blinked. It was not the question he was expecting. What are you talking about, Major? The canyon, she said, gesturing to the map with a slight nod of her head. At just under Mach 1, the pressure wave from the airframe will behave differently down there. It will reflect off the canyon walls. It will create acoustic ghosting and severe barometric turbulence. It will blind their targeting systems, especially their infrared seekers. The model assumes a straight-line threat vector. It doesn't account for weaponizing the environment itself. The colonel stared at her. For a moment, his by-the-book certainty was shaken. What she was describing wasn't in any tactical manual. It was a fluid, instinctive synthesis of physics, aerodynamics, and pure predatory instinct. It was the kind of thinking that got pilots killed, the kind that created legends. He couldn't sanction it. The risk was unquantifiable. That's theoretical, Major. And reckless, he said, his professional mask sliding back into place. The order stands. We are not sending a bird into that meat grinder. Anya held his gaze for a second longer. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. Understood, sir. She turned and walked out of the SOC, her stride unhurried. Vance watched her go, a flicker of uncertainty disturbing his rigid composure. He had dismissed her, just as he had dismissed the mission. But as the door hissed shut behind her, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just looked at the only person in the room who didn't believe the word impossible. The locker room was silent save for the hum of the ventilation. While other pilots headed for the mess hall to decompress, Anya Sharma moved with a quiet, deliberate economy of motion. She pulled on her G-suit, the familiar pressure of the leg bladders a comforting reassurance. She zipped it up, the sound loud in the empty room. On the left shoulder of her flight suit was a custom patch, faded and frayed at the edges. It depicted a stylized gray owl against a black background, its eyes wide and knowing. It was a relic from a previous, unacknowledged deployment, a quiet testament to missions that never made the official reports. The call sign it represented was Echo. She ran a hand over the worn fabric, a silent ritual of connection to the pilot she had to become in the air, a creature of instinct and shadow. Her movements were a practiced liturgy, checking the seals on her helmet, polishing the visor with a soft cloth until it was perfectly clear, securing the oxygen mask connectors. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. This was her sanctuary, the methodical process of gearing up, of shedding the woman on the ground and embracing the extension of the machine she was about to become. Walking out to the flight line, the humid night air was thick with the smells of jet fuel and hot metal. The rain had started, a light drizzle that slicked the tarmac and beaded on the canopy of her F, divided by a -18E Super Hornet. Her bird, number 404, sat waiting under the amber glow of the floodlights, a brooding silhouette of lethality. Unlike the pristine jets favored by the squadron's hotshots, 404 wore its history on its skin. On the port side, just below the cockpit canopy, was a long, thin scar in the composite skin, a jagged line of slightly mismatched gray paint. It was a patch from a shrapnel tear over a forgotten desert, a wound they had both survived. She ran her gloved fingers over the raised edge, a tactile conversation with the only partner she truly trusted. Her crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Salty, who had been working on Hornets since they first flew, stood waiting by the ladder. He had seen the alert, seen the other pilots return to the barracks. He knew what a standby order that never activated meant. He saw the look in her eyes and knew this was different. "Everything's green, Major," he said, his voice a low gravel. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't need to. He just tapped a pylon loaded with a GBU-12 paveway bomb. "This one's extra shiny. Polished it myself." It was his way of saying he understood. His way of saying he had her back. Anya gave him a rare, faint smile. "Thanks, Salty." She climbed the ladder and settled into the cockpit. The world outside vanished, replaced by the familiar embrace of the ejection seat and the intricate geography of switches, screens, and throttles. She strapped herself in, the harness cinching tight, making her one with the machine. With practiced motions, she began the pre-flight check, her hands dancing over the console. Power on. Avionics cooling word to life. The multifunction displays, MFDs, flickered, bathing her face in a green glow. HUD alive. Ins aligning. Engine start sequence initiated. The twin General Electric F-414 engines spooled up with a deep, hungry whine that grew into a ground-shaking roar. The airframe vibrated around her, a living thing waking from its slumber. On one of her MFDs, she pulled up the tactical map of the Zagramos Mountains. The blue icon for Trident was still there, unmoving. The red icons still pulsed. A voice crackled in her helmet, startlingly close. It was Colonel Vance. "Major Sharma, what is your status?" Anya rested her hand on the throttle. Her thumb hovered over the mic switch. She looked at the scarred panel on her jet's flank, visible just at the edge of her peripheral vision. She looked at the map. She listened to the steady, powerful thrum of the engines. "Echo is on station," she replied, her voice calm and even. "Preparing for departure." There was a long pause on the other end. She could almost hear the calculations running through the colonel's mind, the regulations being broken, the careers being risked. But he could also hear the sound of the only asset that could possibly save his men, its engines already screaming with purpose. "Godspeed, Echo," Vance said, his voice barely a whisper. The line went dead. Anya Sharma pushed the throttles forward. The Super Hornet sliced through the rain-swept darkness, a phantom of gray steel and controlled fury. Once clear of the carrier group's airspace, Anya, now just Echo, dropped her bird low, hugging the churning surface of the ocean. The waves clawed at the sky just 50 feet below her fuselage, the salt spray misting her canopy. On her radar, she was a ghost, lost in the sea clutter. This was her element, the liminal space between worlds, too low for long-range radar, too fast for the naked eye. The ingress was a solitary, high-stakes pilgrimage. The world shrank to the glowing symbols on her heads-up display and the feel of the airframe vibrating through the control stick. The weather worsened as she approached the coastline, the drizzle turning into a driving rain that hammered against the cockpit glass. The storm front that had grounded the other pilots was her cloak. She flew into it without hesitation, letting the turbulence buffet the Hornet, her hands making constant, minute adjustments to the stick and rudder, feeling the aircraft's response as if it were an extension of her own nervous system. She crossed the coast as a whisper, a fleeting shadow over desolate, blacked-out fishing villages. The flat coastal plains soon gave way to the jagged teeth of the Zagramos Range. The mountains rose up to meet her like a fortress wall, their peaks shrouded in the same low, angry clouds she was using for cover. This was where the real danger began. Nap of the Earth flying in good weather was risky. At night, in a storm, in uncharted territory, it was an act of calibrated insanity. Echo switched her view to the forward-looking infrared FLIR display, the world outside transforming into a ghostly monochrome landscape of heat signatures. The cold granite of the mountains was black, the streams and rivers a lighter gray. She threaded the needle, flying not over the peaks but through the valleys and passes, her wingtips seemingly close enough to graze the rock walls. The Hornet, an aircraft designed for the open skies, felt claustrophobic here, a caged predator roaring through a stone labyrinth. Her comms were silent. She didn't request updates. She didn't need them. She knew Trident's position. Her job was not to talk, but to arrive. Each twist and turn of the canyon was a calculation of G-force, of wind shear, of the precise moment to roll the aircraft onto its side to slip through a narrow gap. The automated ground proximity warning system screamed in her ear. A frantic, repetitive, pull up, pull up. She silenced it with a flick of a switch. The system was designed for pilots. Couldn't comprehend what she was doing. She was no longer flying the plane. She was wearing it. The canyon walls rushed past in a hypnotic, terrifying blur. Time seemed to stretch and compress. Seconds felt like minutes, and minutes felt like heartbeats. Inside the cockpit, it was an oasis of focused calm. Her breathing was steady, rhythmic, matching the low hum of the environmental control system. Her eyes scanned constantly HUD, FLIR, engine instruments, threat display. The only tension was in her hands, a firm but fluid pressure on the controls. She was a surgeon navigating a complex artery, every movement precise, every decision instantaneous. She was flying on the razor's edge of the flight envelope, a place where the machine's limits and her own became one and the same. Then, a new light flickered on her threat display, a search radar sweeping. It was a mobile unit, high on a ridge to her east. They were hunting. They knew something was coming. Echo didn't try to jam it. Instead, she banked sharply, diving deeper into a subsidiary ravine, putting 1,000 tons of solid granite between her and the radar's pulse. She used the mountain itself as her shield. The radar sweep passed over, finding nothing. She was a ghost again. But now the ghost had a destination, and the hunters were awake. The quiet part of the journey was over. Contact. Technical. 200 meters. Bearing 090. The voice over the radio was strained, punctuated by the sharp crack of incoming machine gun fire. It was Trident's leader, Lieutenant Commander Thorne. His team was pinned behind a series of miserable-looking boulders in the wadi, the 50 caliber rounds from the enemy vehicle kicking up plumes of dirt and rock fragments perilously close to their position. Echo heard the call as she cleared the final ridge, the wadi opening up below her like a dark, jagged scar. Her FLIR display immediately painted the scene in stark relief. The 6 SEALs were cold blue spots huddled behind cover. The technical, a pickup truck with a heavy gun mounted in the back, was a blazing white-hot star, its engine and freshly fired gun barrel radiating immense heat. There was no time for a formal check-in, no room for the ponderous ballet of requesting permission for ordnance release. The men on the ground didn't have the seconds to spare. Anya's thumb moved to the weapons select switch, her fingers dancing across the MFD. She selected the GBU-12 laser-guided bomb. Trident, Echo. Lasing target now, she said, her voice a calm counterpoint to the chaos below. Her tone was flat, professional, a simple statement of intent. On the ground, Thorne, huddled next to his radio man, heard the call. He hadn't even known air support was coming. He risked a glance at the sky, but saw only the churning, black clouds of the storm. Echo? What echo? Command said air was a no-go. Before his radio man could answer, a thin, invisible beam of infrared energy lanced down from the heavens, splashing onto the enemy technical. In Echo's cockpit, the diamond symbol on her HUD locked onto the target with a satisfying chime. She was flying at an impossibly low altitude, screaming towards the engagement zone. A conventional bombing run from this angle was out of the question. There wouldn't be enough time for the bomb to arm, nor enough space to pull up without slamming into the far canyon wall. But Echo wasn't flying a conventional run. She pulled the stick back hard, rolling the Hornet into a knife-edge vertical climb, the G-forces squeezing the air from her lungs. For a breathtaking moment, the aircraft was pointing straight up at the storm clouds. At the apex of her climb, with the jet hanging nearly motionless in the air, she pickled the bomb. The GBU-12 fell away, not dropping, but being tossed upwards and forwards in a high arc. It was a maneuver straight out of an aerobatics show, a move so audacious and unconventional it wasn't in any tactical playbook. As the bomb began its ballistic trajectory towards the target, Echo rolled the Hornet over and dove back into the canyon, the roar of her engines echoing off the rock. On the ground, the SEALs saw nothing. They heard only the sudden, terrifying crescendo of a jet engine seemingly materializing from the rocks around them. Then, as the sound faded, they heard a new noise, a faint, high-pitched whistle. The paveway, guided by the laser that remained locked on the technical, followed its perfect, silent arc. It came down almost vertically, punching through the thin roof of the truck's cab before detonating. The world erupted in a flash of white light and a concussive boom that momentarily deafened them. The technical and its crew ceased to exist, replaced by a crater of scorched earth and twisted, burning metal. A profound silence fell over the wadi, broken only by the crackle of the flames and the patter of the rain. Thorne slowly got to his feet, staring at the wreckage. He keyed his mic, his voice thick with disbelief. "Command, Trident. Be advised, target neutralized." In the COC, Colonel Vance stared at the tactical display. Echo's icon had just performed a maneuver that defied his understanding of aerial combat geometry. The red icon for the heavy gun was gone. The room was utterly silent. A young controller, unable to contain himself, whispered into his headset, "Jesus, good hit. Echo, good hit." Over the encrypted net, Anya Sharma's voice was the only sound. "Trident, Echo, report your next objective." The comm had returned. The Predator had made its first kill. The destruction of the technical sent a ripple of shock through the enemy forces. They had believed themselves untouchable in the storm-swept canyon. Now they knew they were being hunted by a lone, unseen adversary. Their response was swift and intelligent. They adapted. "Echo, Trident. We're seeing movement on the ridges. Looks like they're repositioning." Thorne's voice was tense. The brief respite was over. In her cockpit, Echo's threat receiver confirmed it. Multiple new radar and infrared signatures began to pop up on her display. They weren't powerful SAM sites, but smaller, more mobile threats. ZU-23-2 autocannons and teams carrying shoulder-fired missiles. They were climbing to the canyon rims, creating a lethal web of interlocking fire that would cover every possible escape route for the SEALs. They were turning the entire valley into a flak trap. This time, the voice in her ear wasn't from the ground, but from the SOC. It was Colonel Vance. His tone had undergone a radical transformation. The dismissive skepticism was gone, replaced by a clipped, focused urgency. He had gone from being a spectator to being her second set of eyes. "Echo, command. We're painting 2 ZU-23s on the eastern ridge, elevation approximately 2,000 feet above the canyon floor. Another team with manpads is setting up on the western overhang. You're being boxed in." "Copy," was Echo's only reply. She was already processing the information, her mind a whirlwind of tactical calculations. The bombs were gone. She was down to her 20mm Vulcan cannon and a pair of Sidewinder missiles, useless against ground targets. The cannon was her only remaining tool, but to use it, she'd have to fly directly into the teeth of their guns. Vance's voice came again, a hint of the old, cautious commander returning. "Echo, your mission was to provide initial support. You've opened a window for them. Consider disengaging. Your survivability metrics are dropping rapidly." On the ground, Thorne and his team had started moving, dashing from one piece of cover to the next, heading towards the designated emergency extraction point. But the enemy fire from the ridges was becoming more accurate, pinning them down with frightening regularity. Command, Trident. We can't break contact. They've got us zeroed. We need that fire suppressed. Anya listened to the two competing voices, Vance, the voice of logic and self-preservation, and Thorn, the voice of desperation from the ground. Her decision was already made. She hadn't come this far to leave the job unfinished. Command, Echo. I'm engaging the ridge positions, she stated, not as a request, but as a notification. She banked the Hornet hard, the force of the turn pressing her deep into her seat. The canyon wall filled her canopy view. Vance didn't argue. He didn't order her to stand down. He had seen what she could do. His role had shifted. He was no longer her commander in the traditional sense. He was her support. Copy, Echo. The western position is the primary threat. Their firing angle on Trident's path is optimal. Engaging western target first, she confirmed. She descended, pushing the Hornet lower into the narrowest part of the canyon, using the terrain to mask her approach from the eastern guns. The gunners on the western ridge would see her coming, but they would have only seconds to react. The green light of her HUD reflected in her eyes as she armed the M61 Vulcan cannon. The system spooled up with a menacing, high-pitched whine. The escalation was no longer just a tactical problem. It was a personal duel. On one side, dug-in gunners with a commanding view of the battlefield. On the other, a single pilot in a multimillion-dollar fighter jet, now forced into a knife fight in a phone booth. The enemy had adapted. Now it was her turn. The extraction point was a small, relatively flat scree field 300 meters ahead, a featureless, open killing ground. To get there, Trident team would have to cross it with no cover, completely exposed to the ZU-23s and Manpad's teams now commanding the high ground. It was a suicide run. Echo, this is Trident. Thorn's voice was grim, laced with the dry dust of the wadi. We can't cross. They'll cut us to pieces. Anya looked at the terrain on her display, then at the tactical overlay showing the enemy firing arcs. They formed a perfect interlocking field of fire over the scree field. Going over them was impossible. Going around them was impossible. That left only one option: going through. Her voice, when it came, was unnaturally calm. Trident, stand by. On my mark, you run. Run fast and don't stop. I'm going to draw their fire. Thorn didn't understand. Draw their fire? Echo, they're on the ridges. You can't get a shot without exposing yourself to. He was cut off by the sound. It started as a low rumble that seemed to come from the very rock beneath their feet. It wasn't the sound of a jet overhead. It was deeper, more visceral, a sound that resonated in their bones. Echo had dropped her Super Hornet into the canyon itself, below the level of the ridges. She was now flying inside the death trap. She pushed the throttles to the firewall. The twin engines screamed in protest as she accelerated rapidly, the airframe shuddering as it approached the sound barrier. The narrow canyon walls became a suffocating gray blur on either side of her canopy. The air, trapped and compressed within the geological confines, became thick and violent. Trident, mark! Just as she shouted the word, the Super Hornet went transonic. It didn't create a classic sonic boom. Instead, inside the canyon, the shockwave had nowhere to dissipate. It slammed against the rock walls, reflecting, amplifying, and colliding with itself in a chaotic, deafening cascade of sound and pressure. For the seals on the ground, the effect was apocalyptic. The roar of the jet was instantly replaced by a physical blow, a wave of force that kicked up a storm of dust and pebbles and made the air shimmer. They instinctively dropped to a crouch, hands over their ears, as the mountains themselves seemed to scream. High above on the ridges, the enemy gunners were thrown into chaos. The violent pressure wave hit them like an invisible sledgehammer, stunning them, rattling their teeth. The sound was everywhere and nowhere at once, a disorienting, omnidirectional assault. Their primitive acoustic targeting senses were overwhelmed. They couldn't tell where the jet was, only that it was a monstrous, impossibly loud presence somewhere below them. Then they saw it. A fleeting glimpse of gray. A ghost skimming the canyon floor at over 700 miles per hour. It wasn't flying. It was a projectile. Echo's F-18 was a blur of motion, its wings mere feet from the jagged rock, the heat from its engines distorting the air behind it into a watery mirage. The gunners panicked. They swiveled their weapons, firing wildly into the canyon, not at a target, but at a sound, a memory. Tracers ricocheted harmlessly off the far canyon wall, hundreds of feet behind the speeding jet. The SEALs didn't hesitate. As the chaos erupted above them, they broke cover, sprinting across the open scree field. They ran through a storm of dust and echoes, the ground trembling beneath their feet, their lungs burning. They didn't look up. They just ran, trusting the impossible promise made by a calm voice on the radio. Echo felt the plane buck and shake as it tore through the turbulent air. Her full attention was on the sliver of space ahead of her, her inputs on the stick a constant stream of microcorrections. She was flying on pure instinct, a hair's breadth from disaster. The maneuver was a one-way ticket. She was building up too much speed in a confined space to be able to pull up at the end of the canyon. But she wasn't going to the end. Just as the scree field ended, she saw a narrow side ravine, a geological flaw. It wasn't on the map. It was just a shadow she'd noticed on her initial pass. In a maneuver that defied physics, she rolled the Hornet 90 degrees, wings vertical, and slammed the rudders, skidding the multi-ton fighter into the side canyon. The G-force was immense, a crushing, violent weight that threatened to black her out. She had vanished. To the gunners on the ridge, the jet that had screamed past them had simply flown into a solid wall of rock and disappeared. The diversion had been total. As Echo fought to control the jet in the new, even tighter canyon, Thorne's breathless voice came over the net. Trident is across. We are at the LZ. Even the SEALs had held their breath. The Pave Hawk helicopter, call sign Guardian, was already inbound, its rotors chopping the rainy air. But the extraction zone was about to get very crowded. On Echo's tactical display, new contacts were swarming the SEALs' position. Infantry squads moving rapidly down the slopes, converging on the LZ to cut off the escape. Guardian, this is Trident. We have enemy infantry closing fast. 300 meters to our east and closing. Thorne's transmission was punctuated by the staccato bark of his rifle. Trident, Guardian. We see him. It's gonna be hot. Get ready for a fast pickup. Echo, having threaded her way through the side canyon, now burst back into the main valley like an avenging angel. She had a clear view of the entire scene. The small cluster of SEALs forming a tight perimeter around a wounded comrade, the Pave Hawk lumbering in for a landing, and the enemy soldiers charging down the hillside. She had no bombs left. No missiles. All she had was the M61 Vulcan and 300 rounds of 20mm ammunition. It would have to be enough. Guardian, hold your approach, Echo commanded, her voice cutting through the cross-chatter. Trident, keep their heads down. I'm sanitizing the LZ. She rolled the Hornet in, the nose dipping towards the ground. The eastern slope was a hornet's nest of enemy soldiers. She lined them up in her sights, the HUDs targeting Pipper glowing against the dark terrain. Her thumb squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The Vulcan cannon erupted with a sound that tore the sky in half. A deafening, otherworldly brrrt that was less a series of gunshots and more a continuous, solid roar of destruction. For 2 seconds, a stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds, firing at a rate of 100 per second, slammed into the hillside. The earth erupted. Dirt, rock, and men were thrown into the air as the stream of shells walked its way up the slope, creating a literal wall of fire and steel between the enemy and the SEALs. The lead enemy elements were simply vaporized. The rest scrambled for cover, their advance broken completely. Before the remaining enemy forces could recover, Echo was already banking for a second pass, this time from the north. The Zu-23s on the ridge, their crews having recovered from the sonic shock, began to fire at her, their red tracers lacing the dark sky. She ignored them. They were firing at where she was, not where she was going. She jinked left, then right, her movements unpredictable, making the Hornet an impossible target. Another 2-second burst from the Vulcan shredded the western approach to the LZ. The Pave Hawk pilot watched in awe. The F-18 was a furious Hornet, flying a tight, merciless figure-8 pattern over the extraction zone. It was a shield, a sword, and a promise. It drew every ounce of enemy fire, yet remained untouched. "LZ is clear," the Pave Hawk pilot yelled over the radio. "Trident, get on board now." The helicopter settled into the dusty clearing, its ramp dropping. The SEALs scrambled aboard, carrying their wounded teammate. Echo made one final, low pass, this time without firing, a pure intimidation run. She flew so low over the remaining enemy positions that they could see the heat shimmering from her engines. The psychological impact was devastating. The enemy soldiers broke and ran, wanting no more of the screaming demon that had appeared from the storm. The Pave Hawk's ramp came up. "Trident is secure. Guardian is lifting." Echo stayed, circling the LZ like a protective hawk until the helicopter was clear of the canyon's rim and accelerating towards the safety of the coast. Only then did she bank the Super Hornet, turning its nose for home. Her fuel gauge was blinking red. Her ammunition counter read 0. Her job was done. Back in the Combined Air Operations Center, the tension had been so thick it felt like a physical presence. The entire command staff had stood frozen, watching the telemetry from Echo's aircraft and listening to the comms chatter from the ground. They had witnessed the impossible unfold in real time on their screens. The jagged, chaotic line of Echo's flight path through the canyon looked like a child's scribble, a line that defied all known principles of safe aviation and tactical doctrine. It was a work of art painted with jet fuel and raw courage. When the transmission came through from the Pave Hawk, "Guardian is feet wet. Trident is safe." A collective, ragged breath was released throughout the room. The quiet applause that followed was hesitant at first, then grew stronger. The young communications officer who had first announced Trident's predicament now sat back in his chair, a wide grin of disbelief on his face. Colonel Marcus Vance stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the holographic display. He wasn't looking at the Pave Hawk's safe icon. He was staring at the saved replay of Echo's pivotal maneuver, the transonic pass through the canyon. He watched the simulation of the pressure waves, the chaos it created. He reread her pilot file on a side tablet. Flight hours, qualifications, commendations. It was all just data. It meant nothing compared to what he had just witnessed. The numbers couldn't capture the instinct, the sheer audacity. His models had predicted a 20% chance of survival. He realized with a humbling certainty that his models had failed to account for the pilot. He slowly raised his hand and keyed the command frequency mic. His voice was different now. It was stripped of all authority, all rank. It was just the voice of a man filled with a profound and unexpected sense of awe. "Echo, this is command," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Good work. Bring it home." It was the highest praise he was capable of giving. But another voice cut through the channel before Anya could respond. It was raspy, exhausted, and filled with the static of a helicopter cabin. It was Lieutenant Commander Thorne. "Command, this is Trident Actual," he said, the sounds of the chopper blades audible in the background. The SEAL leader paused, as if gathering his thoughts, searching for words that could possibly suffice. "Tell Echo. Tell her we owe her one." He paused again, and everyone in the SOC leaned in to hear. "I've been doing this for 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. Not in my life." The transmission ended, leaving a ringing silence in the operations center. Vance looked at the empty space in the back of the room where Major Sharma had stood just a few hours before. He had looked right through her. Now he saw her with perfect, searing clarity. He had dismissed the pilot but had been saved by the warrior. He made a quiet note to himself. Update the simulation parameters. Add a new variable. Call it the echo factor. The rain had finally stopped by the time F divided by a -18E Super Hornet number 404 taxied back to its spot on the flight line. The rising sun was a pale, washed-out line on the eastern horizon, casting long shadows across the wet tarmac. The landing had been perfect, a gentle kiss on the runway despite critically low fuel. The canopy opened with a pneumatic hiss, breaking the morning stillness. The ground crew, led by Master Sergeant Salty, approached the aircraft with a reverence usually reserved for a holy site. They moved quietly, their usual boisterous energy subdued. They saw the state of the jet. The fuselage was streaked with grime and scored by the heat of its own exertions. There were new marks, small dings and scratches on the wing roots and tail fins from rock fragments kicked up during the canyon run. The jet looked exhausted, used, and victorious. Salty placed the ladder against the fuselage and looked up. Major Anya Sharma sat motionless in the cockpit for a long moment, the engine spooling down with a final, mournful whine. She went through her shutdown sequence with the same methodical precision she did everything else. Finally, she unbuckled her harness and pulled off her helmet, setting it carefully on the canopy rail. Her face was pale with fatigue, her hair matted with sweat, but her eyes were clear and calm. She swung her legs over the side and descended the ladder. When her boots touched the ground, Salty was waiting. He didn't speak. He simply looked from her face, to the scarred and weathered jet, and back to her face. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a salute. It was something more profound. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated respect from one professional to another. It was an acknowledgement of the impossible thing she and this machine had just accomplished together. Anya gave a slight nod in return, the only communication necessary. She walked away from the aircraft, her boots leaving damp prints on the tarmac. The Super Hornet stood behind her, ticking and groaning softly as its overworked metal and electronics began to cool. The heat shimmered off its engine nacelles, a visible exhalation of relief. The jet looked like a loyal, weary animal resting after a desperate fight, its scarred panel a badge of honor. The silence of the hangar swallowed her as she walked inside. There were no cheering crowds, no formal debriefs yet, no medals being presented. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a job done, of lives saved. Respect hadn't been demanded or requested. It had been forged in the fire of a storm-swept canyon, earned at the edge of the sound barrier. It was a quiet, unshakable thing, as solid and real as the cooling steel of the machine she had left resting in the dawn.